So, the last time that we were here, we were talking a little bit about the ego center for our different senses. Now, one thing that I will mention is that relative to vision and hearing, which are both somewhat more passive senses, touch is a much more active sense. If you want to figure out information with touch, somebody either has to touch you or you have to reach out to touch it. So we tend to find that for vision, our frame of reference is an ego center that basically exists between the eyes. For hearing, we have our azimuth. Our ego center is basically directly between our ears and the center of the head. So how can we figure out a frame of reference for ego center and touch? Well, a pretty straightforward way to do this that researchers have done, and your book gives you a way to try this yourself. So basically what you try to do is you take your left hand, you take one hand and basically put it under part of a table and basically put a pencil up to it. And then you basically try with the other hand on the top of the table to see if you can get those points to match. And what we tend to find when people actually are looking for the ego center is that the ego center is basically in touch, constantly shifting. There is no static ego center with touch. It is entirely based on what arm, for example, is doing the reaching. Now, likewise, when we try to do studies looking at spatial orientation, one way that researchers have tried to basically figure out spatial orientation and frame of reference is by having people rotate these two pencils until they are basically in parallel. And what we find is that though people do tend to get better as they do this task, what we tend to find is that people constantly make mistakes and errors, in some cases being as much as 40 degrees off from each other. And if they're parallel, there would be 0-degree displacement. So a 40-degree displacement is a pretty big difference. So what this tells us is that it's a lot easier to figure out an ego center when you're dealing with a very passive sense, where you don't actually have to engage in active sensing. But with something like touch, where we do actually have to reach toward an object or grasp an object to learn about it, our ego center is constantly going to be shifting to different reference points. So I want to close with one quick section about social touch. And one of the things that we find is that touch can often influence our social judgments. If we receive a touch from a person, we tend to think more warmly of that person. When we like somebody or we're fond of somebody, we tend to think about them in terms related to warm touch. And research has shown that social touch is very much an epigenetic trait. So researchers find that rat pups that are basically groomed and licked by their mothers are going to be more likely to groom and lick their rat pups when they have children, and they're more likely to engage in licking and grooming themselves. Now, you could say, well, that's just because of how they're trained. But you can take new rat pups that were born from different mothers, put them in with a mother that grooms and licks, and they'll be more likely to groom and lick themselves. And what we find is that social touch like this is an epigenetic trait. People do have genetic traits for how often they will engage in social touch. Some people are warmer and more affectionate and more huggy. Other people are not. And these traits can be turned on and off by the environment. Generally, we're going to find that rats that were not licked or groomed by their mothers, even if they had a genetic predisposition to do so, will tend to be a lot more timid as a result. And additionally, touch is a way to increase bonds. It's part of the reason why, especially if you are living alone right now, that this period of isolation that we're going through is so difficult, because one of the ways that we bond with each other is through touch. We can't hug anymore. We can't really shake hands anymore. And that can be a big source of pain. We actually know that there are people who are touch starved. But in addition to part of the reason that these bonds are being created through release of endorphins and oxytocin, which can increase a bond, we do also know that touch increases activity in the insula, which is also an area that really codes for physical warmth. All right, folks, so this is the second to last week of lecture. Next week, I will start recording lectures on taste and a little bit of smell, and I will see you very soon. Take care.